When Vanessa Sinclair watched Ryan Cole's battered old pickup roll up in front of the estate, she laughed loud enough for 100 guests to hear. "Single dads never amount to anything," she announced, her voice cutting clean through the string quartet until the musicians lost the thread of the song. Ryan didn't answer her. He adjusted his cuff, gave his daughter a calm, reassuring look, and walked past the red carpet without slowing down. But the moment Preston Sinclair ordered security to drag him off the property, the sky answered before anyone else could. A silver Gulfstream marked with the Cole Aviation crest touched down on the private runway just past the garden, and the first man off the stairs lowered his head to Ryan in respect. If you want to watch an arrogant man finally get exactly what's coming to him, hit subscribe and stick around for the moment everything turns. Ryan Cole is about to get everything he's owed. The Sinclair Sky Manor sat on 80 acres of manicured Colorado hillside, close enough to the private airstrip that guests could feel the low hum of idling engines through the soles of their designer shoes. Every year, the family threw a scholarship gala there, white tablecloths, towers of champagne, a night supposedly dedicated to celebrating the region's future engineers. Everyone who attended understood the real point was reminding the valley exactly who still ran things. Limousines creeped up the driveway in a slow, gleaming line, joined by the occasional private helicopter settling onto the west lawn like a dragonfly landing on still water. When Ryan Cole's pickup came around the bend, its paint faded to a sun-bleached blue, heads turned. A young valet actually walked toward the driver's side with a delivery slip in hand, certain the man behind the wheel had mistaken the entrance. Ryan stepped out in a simple charcoal suit, well-made, understated, the kind of quiet polish that never tried to compete with the mansion behind it. The night smelled of cut grass and champagne, with a thread of jet fuel drifting over from the runway beyond the hedges, a scent that had trailed him through most of his adult life, whether this crowd realized it or not. He didn't flinch under the weight of the stairs. He'd learned long ago that the fastest way through a room like this was to walk it as if he already belonged there. So he squared his shoulders and let the whispers roll past him like weather he'd already dressed for. Tucked in his breast pocket was a folded card his daughter Emma mailed him 2 weeks earlier, her handwriting careful and a little anxious, telling him that all she wanted tonight was for him to be standing there when her name was called. He'd read it so many times the fold had gone soft, and he touched it once through the fabric of his jacket, the way another man might touch a rosary. Emma came down the front steps almost running, her gown catching the porch light, relief and worry crossing her face at once when she spotted Vanessa and Preston watching from the top of the stairs like a pair of judges. For a moment, father and daughter just looked at each other, and in that look sat 10 years of exhaustion, love, and stubborn survival that no one else on that lawn could possibly have understood. Vanessa crossed the gravel first, her heels clicking out a rhythm that sounded almost rehearsed, the same practiced walk she used whenever cameras or important guests were nearby. She asked Ryan, not unkindly at first, why he hadn't arranged something more fitting for their daughter's big night, her eyes flicking once toward the truck as if it might disappear if she stared hard enough. Ryan told her simply that the truck still ran fine and that it had carried Emma to school every single morning for 10 years, through blizzards, through broken alarms, through the long gray stretch after the divorce when neither of them had much reason to smile before 8 a.m. Preston arrived a beat later, wearing the particular smile of a man who liked being underestimated by absolutely no one but himself,
his hand resting on the small of Vanessa's back with the easy possessiveness of someone used to owning whatever stood beside him. He remarked that sentiment didn't pay the caterers, and that Ryan had only made it through the gate because Emma insisted, his tone light and amused, as if he were doing Ryan a favor just by acknowledging he existed. Ryan didn't rise to it. He'd taken worse from better men, and Preston's condescension slid off him the way rain slides off a windshield built to handle it. He said only that he'd come for his daughter, not to impress anyone standing on that lawn, then walked toward the house without waiting for a reply, his stride unhurried, his spine straight. Vanessa watched the truck a moment longer, then murmured to Preston that Ryan hadn't changed a bit, still broke, still stubborn, still convinced that pride could stand in for a bank account. Preston chuckled and said some men simply never learned to want more for themselves. And Vanessa, for reasons she wouldn't examine again until much later that night, found herself agreeing a little too quickly. Inside the ballroom, a wall of screens played highlight reels of the Sinclair family legacy, Preston's face looming large as the host praised him as the guardian of the region's aviation future, even as the company's books, hidden from every camera in the room, bled money by the week. Emma had been seated at the head table beside her mother and stepfather, her name card resting next to crystal glassware worth more than most people's monthly rent. Ryan, by contrast, was shown to a small table near the kitchen doors, tucked among drivers and technicians who'd only been invited because their labor made the evening possible. Emma tried to object, tugging at her mother's sleeve, but Ryan caught her eye and shook his head slightly, unwilling to let her night turn into a fight over a seating chart.
A few guests recognized him from years back when he'd worked as an aircraft mechanic at the regional airfield and asked with pity, dressed up as curiosity, whether he still spent his days in that same drafty hangar with the leaking roof and the space heater that never quite kept up with a Colorado winter. Ryan told them only that he still worked in aviation, which was, in its own quiet way, entirely true. He kept his answers short, not out of shame, but because he'd learned that explaining yourself to people who've already decided who you are rarely changes anything. Vanessa overheard and corrected him in front of the table, saying Ryan had always been full of ideas, just never quite practical enough to turn any of them into something worth having. Her voice was pitched just loud enough to carry to the neighboring seats, and a ripple of polite, uncomfortable laughter moved around the table, the kind that costs nothing to give and everything to receive. In the silence that followed, memory pulled at Ryan the way it always did on nights like this. After Vanessa left, he'd worked overnight shifts at the airfield, cared for Emma through the day on almost no sleep, and repaired rented aircraft on weekends just to cover the gap between rent and groceries. He remembered the particular cold of that hangar at 4 a.m, the smell of hydraulic fluid and burnt coffee, the sound of Emma's small voice on speakerphone asking if he'd make it home before she fell asleep. He remembered promising her every single time that he would, and somehow, through sheer stubbornness, he always had. Vanessa had once called that leased hangar, where he tinkered after hours on a failed dream, standing in its doorway with her arms crossed, telling him that dreams didn't keep the lights on. She never learned it had become the very first address of Cole Aviation Holdings, the exact spot where, years later, he'd sign the paperwork that changed everything and tell no one but his accountant. His phone buzzed once against his thigh, a message from Maya Collins confirming the weather had cleared and her team would touch down on the Sinclair runway within 40 minutes, acquisition paperwork finalized and ready for signature.
Ryan slid the phone back into his pocket and sat perfectly still, as if nothing in the world had shifted, though everything had. Moments later, the MC returned to the microphone to announce that this year's anonymous donor had contributed $5 million to the scholarship fund, though the name behind the gift would stay sealed until the ceremony's end. Vanessa took the stage not long after, delivering a polished speech about the responsibility parents carry in shaping their children's futures, her praise for Preston sweeping and theatrical, calling him the very model of a self-made man. When her eyes landed on Ryan near the back of the room, she called him forward, and for one brief moment the crowd assumed she meant some gesture of reconciliation for their daughter's sake. Instead, she asked, in front of everyone, how much he personally had contributed to Emma's scholarship. Ryan answered that he didn't believe a parent's love was meant to be priced in front of an audience. Preston jumped in immediately, remarking that men who couldn't contribute financially often preferred to dress up their shortcomings as principle. A ripple of laughter moved through the nearer tables. Emma rose halfway out of her chair before Vanessa's hand pressed her back down.
Vanessa pressed further, reminding the room that Ryan had once promised to build an aviation company of his own, and that a decade later all he had to show for it was an old truck and a small house on the edge of town. Her voice carried the particular certainty of someone who'd told this story to herself so many times she'd stopped questioning whether it was still true. She said she'd left because she refused to raise their daughter beside a man with no future. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman murmured that she understood completely, that no mother should be blamed for wanting more for her child. Ryan felt Emma's eyes on him, wide and frightened, and kept his own gaze steady on Vanessa, refusing to let the room see anything resembling a wound. He asked quietly whether she truly meant to turn their daughter's night into a retrial of a marriage that ended years ago, his voice low enough that people had to lean in to hear, which somehow made it land harder than shouting would have. Preston, sensing an opening, summoned security and announced that Ryan had ruined the evening's mood and needed to be shown off the property immediately. As two guards started forward, the windows along the ballroom began to hum, a low vibration rolling through the glass as a jet engine descended somewhere beyond the garden wall. Guests spilled out onto the terrace to see what had disturbed the sky, champagne glasses forgotten on tabletops, conversations abandoned mid-sentence. A silver Gulf Stream came down onto the private runway with the practiced grace of a bird returning to familiar water, its landing lights cutting twin white beams through the darkening blue, its tail marked with a bold letter C beneath the Cole aviation crest. The engines wound down to a low, contented growl as the aircraft taxied toward the hangar, and for a moment even the band inside stopped playing, sensing correctly that whatever was happening on that runway mattered more than anything scripted for the evening. Preston was furious that no flight had been logged with him personally, demanding an explanation from the field manager on duty, his voice climbing an octave higher than he probably intended. The manager, unbothered, told him the flight had actually been cleared by Sinclair Aeronautics itself 2 weeks earlier, arranged for representatives of the company currently in talks to acquire the struggling firm. Preston's anger dissolved into something closer to hunger, certain a billionaire mystery had arrived to save his empire. He smoothed his jacket, checked his reflection in the nearest window, and ordered the red carpet unrolled a second time, already rehearsing the gracious smile he planned to wear for whoever stepped off that plane.
The cabin door opened, and Maya Collins came down the stairs first, trailed by 2 attorneys and a senior auditor, her heels sure on the metal steps despite the late hour and the long flight behind her. Jonah Pierce, the company's longtime captain, walked a step behind her, still in his crisp Navy uniform, cap tucked under one arm. Preston hurried forward to greet Maya personally, introducing himself as the owner of the estate and, by implication, the man they'd come to see, his hand already extended, his smile already fixed in place. Maya answered politely that the person they needed was already on the grounds, her eyes moving past him as if he were simply part of the landscaping. Jonah's gaze swept the crowd until it landed on Ryan, still standing between the 2 security guards who had frozen mid-motion, hands hovering uselessly near his elbows now that neither of them knew what to do. Jonah crossed the lawn, ignored Preston entirely, and stopped in front of Ryan with the kind of respect reserved for men who've earned it the hard way, the 2 of them exchanging a look that carried a decade of early mornings, grounded flights, and hard-won contracts behind it. "Mr. Cole," he said, "your team's arrived, and the final agreement is waiting on your signature." The garden fell into a silence deeper than any speech Vanessa had given all night, broken only by the distant tick of the jet's cooling engines. Maya handed Ryan a leather folder stamped with the Cole Aviation Holdings seal, then turned to ask evenly why the owner of the company funding this very gala had been detained by security at his own daughter's celebration. Preston insisted there had been some kind of mix-up. Vanessa stared at Ryan, waiting for him to admit the aircraft was merely rented for effect, some elaborate stunt meant to embarrass her in return. Ryan took the small brass key Jonah offered him, turned it once between his fingers, and asked Preston, without raising his voice, whether he still intended to throw out the only buyer left who could keep his company from collapsing. Maya then told the stunned crowd, plainly and without theater, that Ryan Cole owned Cole Aviation Holdings outright, along with a fleet of private aircraft worth several $100 million.
Through Maya's steady account and a handful of quiet memories surfacing in Ryan's own mind, the shape of the last decade came into focus. After the divorce, Ryan designed a predictive maintenance system that let cargo carriers catch engine failures before they grounded a plane, working out the early equations on napkins and the backs of invoices during the slow hours of his overnight shifts. Rather than sell the technology outright for cash, he'd taken equity in every airline willing to license it, a decision his own lawyer had called reckless at the time and brilliant in hindsight. What began as a rented hangar with a single leased freight aircraft grew patiently and without fanfare into maintenance depots scattered across 3 states, cargo routes stitching together cities larger carriers had abandoned, and eventually a private charter division serving clients who never once asked to see the face behind the company. He'd stayed out of the press deliberately, having once watched Emma targeted by so-called friends who wanted nothing but access to money that wasn't even hers yet, a memory that still made his jaw tighten whenever it resurfaced. He wanted his daughter to grow up whole before she learned the true scale of what her family owned, to know the taste of hard work before she ever tasted the comfort that work had purchased. The old truck had never been a symbol of poverty at all. It was the truck he drove the night Vanessa walked out, headlights cutting through rain that hadn't let up for 3 days. The one he used to pick Emma up from school the next morning and every morning after, because some things, once they worked, he simply refused to let go of, no matter how large his bank balance eventually grew. Vanessa's memory turned over itself as she stood there replaying years she'd once been certain she understood,
The long business trips she'd resented, the calls from unfamiliar attorneys she assumed were about debt, the nights he refused to discuss money at all. She'd read every one of them as evidence of failure rather than discretion. Preston, grasping for anything to save face in front of his own board members, said wealth alone didn't make a man a good father, and hinted that Emma had been forced to live in an ordinary house instead of enjoying the fortune that was rightfully hers. It was Emma who finally spoke, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it, stepping forward so the whole terrace could hear her clearly. She said her father had shown up for every exam, every interview, every night she wanted to give up on herself entirely, that he'd sat in a hard plastic chair through 100 parent-teacher conferences and never once made her feel like a burden he was carrying alone. He never bought her an easy life, she said, her chin lifted, her voice not breaking once. He built her a strong enough one to make her own. Vanessa realized, watching her daughter's face, that Emma had never once been ashamed of Ryan, not in the years he wore second-hand shoes to school functions, not now that a private jet sat gleaming on the runway behind them. The person burning with shame in that garden was Vanessa herself, and the realization landed with a weight she'd spent a decade avoiding.
Moments later, the MC returned to the microphone, a note trembling slightly in her hand, announcing that the anonymous $5 million donor behind this year's scholarship fund was the Cole Horizon Foundation, founded and personally financed by Ryan Cole. The mood among the guests shifted like weather changing direction. People who'd laughed at Ryan an hour earlier now angled toward him with business cards ready, insisting they'd always admired a man who built something from nothing. Ryan paid them little attention. He turned instead to Emma and asked whether she wanted to stay for the rest of the ceremony or leave the estate altogether. She chose to stay. Not for the Sinclair name, but for the other students still waiting to hear whether their scholarships would be honored. Maya explained to the gathered board members why Cole Aviation had come at all. Sinclair Aeronautics was carrying hundreds of millions in unpaid debt and would be unable to make payroll within the month. Preston had quietly shopped the company to outside buyers for weeks, while hiding its true condition from almost everyone, including his own wife. Cole Aviation was the only interested party willing to retain most of the workforce and keep the maintenance facilities running under new ownership. Ryan told the room plainly that he had no interest in the mansion, the family name, or the Sinclair brand stitched across every hangar door. What mattered to him were the 800 engineers, mechanics, and support staff whose jobs hung on whether this deal closed cleanly. Preston tried to reframe the moment as a negotiation between two powerful men, pulling Ryan toward a private study and promising a public apology in exchange for a signature that same night. Ryan refused, telling him an apology purchased with a contract stopped being an apology the moment money entered the conversation. Before anything could be signed, Maya said there was a more urgent matter tied to the Sinclair Charitable Fund that needed resolving first. Vanessa, who had spent years as the fund's public face while leaving the finances entirely in Preston's hands, felt the first real flicker of unease pass through her. Maya laid a folder on the table showing that several million meant for the scholarship program instead had been funneled toward the upkeep of the estate and Preston's private aircraft. Preston denied it at once, insisting the transfers were legitimate promotional and operating expenses for the foundation, his voice climbing as though volume alone might make the numbers disappear.
Maya calmly produced falsified invoices, payments routed through shell vendors registered in states neither Vanessa nor the board had ever heard of, and receipts for 2 separate personal vacations disguised as donor outreach trips. All of it uncovered during standard due diligence ahead of the acquisition. She laid each document on the table with the unhurried patience of someone who'd done this before and knew exactly how the story would end.
Vanessa recognized her own signature on several of the documents and felt something cold settle in her chest. Aware that Preston had leaned on the authority she'd granted him to push through transactions she never fully understood, she thought back to the countless times she'd signed whatever he placed in front of her without reading past the first paragraph, trusting him the way she'd once trusted very little else in her life. She was not entirely without fault, and Ryan made no attempt to soften that truth for her. She'd ignored warning signs for years because the lifestyle those warning signs protected was one she'd grown unwilling to give up, and some quiet, honest part of her had always known that, even when she refused to look at it directly. Howard Ashton, chairman of the Sinclair Aeronautics Board, a heavy-set man with a gray mustache and a reputation for saying very little until it mattered, informed Preston he was being removed from active leadership pending a full internal investigation. His tone carried no cruelty, only the flat finality of a man who'd seen enough falsified numbers in his career to recognize the pattern within minutes. Preston turned his fury on Ryan, accusing him of orchestrating the entire evening to humiliate the Sinclair family in public, his composure finally cracking. Ryan reminded him, without raising his voice, that he'd requested 3 private meetings over the past month, each one refused because Preston considered the owner of Cole Aviation nothing more than a mechanic who'd gotten lucky, a man not worth an hour of his calendar. Ryan had kept the declined meeting requests dated and time-stamped and offered to have Maya forward them to the board should anyone doubt his account. Preston had chosen the gala itself as the venue for closing the deal, hoping the sheer spectacle of wealth might pressure his mystery buyer into signing without asking too many questions. He never imagined that buyer was the very man he'd tried to have escorted off his own lawn. Vanessa began to understand, watching her husband unravel in real time, that the collapse unfolding around them hadn't been caused by Ryan at all. It had been built for years out of arrogance, deception, and a habit of looking down on anyone the Sinclairs decided was beneath them. The board turned to Ryan and asked him to state the formal terms under which the acquisition would proceed. He laid out 4 conditions without hesitation. Preston would step down from every leadership position tied to the company. The foundation's finances would undergo an independent audit from top to bottom. Any personal assets purchased with the foundation money would be sold and the funds returned in full. And every employee's job, salary, and benefits would be protected for a minimum of 3 years under the new ownership. Ryan added one further condition, that the scholarship program be separated entirely from the Sinclair name and placed under the stewardship of educators, engineers, and student representatives, no longer used as a public relations tool for a family whose name had just been dragged through the mud of its own making. The board agreed within minutes, aware the only alternative on the table was outright bankruptcy. Preston erupted, accusing Ryan of using the deal as revenge for a marriage that ended a decade earlier. Ryan answered that real revenge would have looked like standing back and letting the whole company collapse under its own weight. Saving 800 jobs wasn't vengeance, it was simply the responsible thing to do.
Vanessa pulled Ryan aside, away from the board and the remaining guests, into the relative quiet near the edge of the terrace where string lights swayed gently overhead, and asked him quietly to soften the terms, if only to protect what remained of her reputation and Preston's. Her voice had lost all its earlier certainty, replaced now by something closer to genuine fear. She reminded him they were still Emma's parents, hoping the fact of that shared history might loosen his resolve the way it once might have years ago, before either of them had learned how far apart they'd grown. Ryan told her plainly that she couldn't stand in front of a room full of strangers and call single fathers failures, then reach for their daughter as a shield the moment consequences finally arrived. His voice never rose above a conversational register, which somehow made the words cut deeper than shouting ever could have. He wasn't interested in destroying her, but he wasn't willing to lie for the sake of an image she'd spent years building on a foundation that was never honest to begin with, not to him, and eventually not even to herself. Through the terrace windows, Vanessa watched staff quietly removing the Sinclair nameplate from the podium where she delivered her speech only an hour before. And for the first time, she understood that the status she'd spent her adult life chasing had never truly belonged to her at all. Preston still refused to sign his resignation, convinced Ryan would never risk the fallout of hundreds of lost jobs just to remove one man from a company, clinging to that belief the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. Maya opened a second folder and explained in a voice utterly without malice that Cole Aviation had already purchased the majority of Sinclair Aeronautics' secured debt from its lending banks the week before, a quiet maneuver completed well before anyone at the Gala had even known the acquisition was in motion. That meant Ryan didn't need Preston's voluntary cooperation here. Cole Aviation could simply take control of the assets through the standard debt restructuring process already underway. Ryan still offered the gentler path, the one where Preston resigned quietly, the company kept operating, and the workforce stayed protected without further disruption. Preston turned to Vanessa and demanded she pressure Emma into convincing her father to relent. It was in that instant Vanessa finally saw, with total clarity, that Preston treated every relationship in his life as leverage to be spent. Emma refused to be used at all, telling her stepfather that her father had spent his whole life shielding her from the battles adults chose to fight, and she would not become a weapon turned back against him now.
The board voted that same night to suspend Preston from every remaining position he held. The decision unanimous and reached with a speed that suggested more than one member had been waiting years for the excuse. Security was asked to escort him out through the very corridor he'd planned to use against Ryan only hours earlier, a symmetry no one in the garden failed to notice. Ryan didn't mock him or strip away whatever dignity the man had left. He'd never needed to raise his voice to win an argument, and he saw no reason to start now that the outcome was already settled. His calm, unshaken presence made Preston's downfall louder than any insult ever could have, the silence around him somehow more damning than applause. As Preston passed the old pickup truck parked near the gate, his reflection briefly caught in its dusty window, the runway lights behind him lighting the length of the Cole Aviation jet like a stage no longer meant for the Sinclair name. For the first time all evening, he looked exactly what he was, a man who had mistaken inherited comfort for earned power. After Preston's departure, the gala all but dissolved. Guests slipped out through side doors in twos and threes, unwilling to be photographed anywhere near a scandal of this size, their earlier flattery evaporating as quickly as it had arrived.
The band packed away their instruments in silence. Staff cleared half-finished plates from tables that would never be filled again that night. Vanessa found Ryan inside the hangar beside the runway, reviewing paperwork with Maya under the low hum of fluorescent light, the smell of jet fuel and machine oil hanging in the cool night air, so different from the perfume and candle wax of the ballroom she'd just left behind. He gave her a few minutes despite the late hour, setting his pen down without complaint, the way he'd always given people more grace than they expected of him. Vanessa admitted she'd always believed Ryan lacked ambition, mostly because he never spoke about grand plans the way Preston constantly had, filling every room with talk of expansion and legacy and empire. She'd chosen Preston because he offered money and power and promises dressed up in expensive fabric, and for a long time those promises had felt like proof she'd made the right choice. Ryan told her the problem was never that she left. Plenty of marriages ended, and no one owed the other a lifetime simply because they'd once shared a roof. The problem was that after leaving, she needed to turn him into a failure in order to prove her choice had been the right one, needed the story to make sense in a way that let her sleep at night. And in doing so, she'd spent years teaching their daughter to see her own father through a lens built entirely out of someone else's insecurity. Vanessa apologized for the words she'd spoken in front of 100 strangers about single fathers, her voice thinner now than it had been all night, stripped of the polish she usually wore like armor. Ryan accepted the apology, but made clear that forgiveness didn't erase what had already been said, nor did it obligate anything to return to the way it once was. Some sentences, once spoken aloud in front of a crowded room, simply stayed spoken, no matter how sincerely the speaker later wished them back.
She asked why he'd never once mentioned how much he was worth. Ryan told her that a man could hide money easily enough, but he couldn't hide the way he treated people he assumed had no power at all. And he'd needed to know, without warning, exactly how she and people like her truly saw men like him. Vanessa realized that without the jet, without the accountants, without the sudden reversal of fortune playing out in front of witnesses, she never would have apologized at all. And that realization made the apology feel smaller in her own hands than she wanted it to be. Ryan encouraged her to cooperate fully with the auditors, take responsibility for what she'd allowed herself to overlook for years, and begin rebuilding a life that no longer depended on the Sinclair name to hold it up. Emma appeared in the hangar doorway a few minutes later, but she didn't run to comfort her mother. She simply said that whatever remained between them could still be repaired, provided Vanessa proved it through action rather than another speech delivered for an audience. The acquisition was finalized just before sunrise, the ink barely dry when the sky outside began turning pale gold over the mountains, the kind of light that made even a Gothic scandal-scarred estate look briefly forgiving. Cole Aviation absorbed Sinclair Aeronautics entirely, retaining all 800 employees and renaming the facility Cole Technical Air Works within the week, a small ceremony held not for cameras but for the mechanics and ground crew who'd spent years wondering whether their paychecks would keep coming. The scholarship fund was formally separated from the Sinclair family name for good, its new board made up entirely of educators and working engineers who understood better than any Sinclair ever had what it meant to build something from very little. Emma declined the privilege attached to her own award and asked that it be given instead to another applicant with fewer advantages than she'd grown up with, a decision that surprised no one who truly knew her. Ryan agreed, but reminded his daughter she owed no guilt for the success her father had built.
What mattered now was using what they had responsibly and teaching others to do the same, a lesson he intended to keep repeating for as long as she needed to hear it. Maya had the jet prepared to fly Ryan and Emma out to visit the university that had accepted her into its aviation engineering program, the same field her father had once learned by hand, wrench by wrench, in a hangar with a leaking roof. As they crossed the tarmac, the same people who'd laughed at Ryan hours earlier now stood in silence, watching him walk past without a single glance in their direction, their earlier certainty about who deserved respect quietly dismantled by the events of one long evening.
Vanessa remained on the front steps of the estate, alone for the first time in years, with no Preston beside her, no stage beneath her feet, and no guests left to flatter, the cold morning air settling around her like something she would need to get used to. Ryan paused beside the old pickup truck one last time before boarding, resting his palm briefly against the sun-warmed hood the way another man might rest a hand on an old friend's shoulder. From inside the cab, he retrieved a faded photograph of Emma from the very first morning the two of them had begun building a life together, just the pair of them and a rented hangar full of borrowed tools, her small face gap-toothed and grinning in a way that still made something in his chest loosen whenever he looked at it. Emma asked whether he planned to sell the truck now that the whole world finally knew who he really was. Ryan smiled and told her the truck had never once made him feel poor. It had only ever made shallow people believe they understood exactly who he was, when in fact they'd never bothered to look closely at all, never noticed the careful maintenance under the hood, or the quiet pride he took in keeping something running long after anyone expected it to last. Together they climbed the short steps into the cabin of the jet, the same aircraft that had upended an entire evening only hours before, its interior now simply another quiet place for father and daughter to sit side by side. Before the door sealed shut, Emma glanced back toward her mother, standing alone on the terrace, small and still against the pale morning light. She didn't turn away entirely, but she didn't run back either. The chance to rebuild what had broken between them still existed, though Vanessa alone would have to walk the rest of that distance on her own, one honest choice at a time, with no jet arriving to make the decision easy for her. The Gulf Stream lifted off the Sinclair runway just as the sun cleared the ridgeline, its shadow sweeping briefly across the estate below, where workers were already unbolting the family's name from the gate at the edge of the property, the metal letters coming down one at a time until nothing remained but the pale outline where they'd hung for 30 years. Ryan didn't look back at the house he was leaving behind. He'd spent too many years building something of his own to waste a single moment mourning a name that never been his to begin with. He looked instead at his daughter beside him, the same girl he'd raised through years when almost no one believed in either of them, through overnight shifts and second-hand shoes and nights when the electricity bill came before anything else, and understood that everything he'd built, the aircraft, the holdings, the quiet fortune no one at that gala had seen coming, meant nothing beside the simple fact that she was still, after everything, proud to call him her father. That, more than any contract signed in a hangar before sunrise, was the only inheritance that had ever truly mattered to him. Vanessa once called single fathers failures in front of 100 strangers, but as Ryan Cole's jet climbed above a house already losing its name, she finally understood that the real failure was never the man left holding a child alone. It was the person who walked away before she ever understood what he was worth.